It was 1952, in a cramped office on a hill above the Hudson River, and a young woman bent over a drafting table was looking at something no human being had ever seen. Not a photograph, not a sample dragged up in a net, a shape. She had taken thousands of numbers, the depths of the ocean read off paper rolls from ships crossing the Atlantic, and she had turned them into lines on paper, profiles of the sea bottom cut from one side of the ocean to the other, and in the middle of every single line, right at the top of the great mountain range that ran down the center of the Atlantic, there was a notch, a V-shaped gash, the same in one profile after another, hundreds of miles apart, as if something had taken a knife and split the seafloor straight down the middle for thousands of miles. She thought she knew what it was. She thought it was a crack in the planet. She thought it might mean the continents really did move, the one idea in geology that respectable scientists had spent 30 years laughing out of the room. When she showed it to the man she worked with, he told her she was wrong. He told her it was, in his words, girl talk. And then he had her erase it and draw it again. Her name was Marie Tharp, and she would be proven right. It would take years, and for most of them the credit would go to other people, and she was never once allowed to go out on the ships that gathered the data she lived inside. She mapped the floor of the ocean from a desk. She drew the bottom of the sea without ever going under it, and the map she made would help overturn everything we thought we knew about the ground beneath our feet. This is the story of how that happened, and of how easy it is for the world to look right past the person who saw it first. To understand what Marie Tharp did, you have to understand how little anyone knew about the ocean floor when she started. We tend to assume that by the middle of the 20th century, the map of the world was basically finished. The continents were charted, the mountains were named. Men had stood at the North Pole and the South Pole, but more than 2/3 of the planet was underwater, and that 2/3 was almost a complete blank. People pictured the deep seabed as a flat, drowned plain, a boring expanse of mud sloping gently away from the shore, dark and dead and featureless. Some maps just left it empty. The bottom of the ocean was, in a real sense, the last unexplored place on Earth, and it was hidden under miles of black water that no light and no diver could reach. Marie Tharp was an unlikely person to change that, and not because she lacked the mind for it. She had the mind. The problem was the time she was born into. She came into the world in 1920 in Ypsilanti, Michigan, the only child of a soil surveyor for the federal government. Her father spent his life making maps of dirt, traveling from county to county to chart what kind of soil lay where, and young Marie went with him. By the time she was grown, she had attended more than 20 different schools, following his work across the country. She grew up with the smell of fresh paper and the sight of a man turning the invisible underground into something you could see on a page. It got into her bones early, though she did not know yet what it was for. She did not set out to be a scientist. In the 1920s and 1930s, that door was barely open to a woman, and nobody pointed her toward it. She earned a degree in English and music. She took every subject she could, and then the world cracked open in a way that, for her, opened a door. When the United States entered the Second World War, the men left the universities for the military, and suddenly the science departments that had never wanted women were desperate for anyone who could do the work. The University of Michigan opened its geology program to women, almost as an emergency measure, because the oil companies needed people to find petroleum, and there were no men left to train. Marie Tharp walked through that door. She earned a master's degree in geology in 1944, and later, while she was already working, she earned a second bachelor's degree in mathematics. She had the rare combination of skills that the next part of her life would demand. She could read the earth, and she could handle the numbers. Her first job showed her exactly where she stood. She went to work for an oil company in Tulsa, Oklahoma, as a junior geologist, and they would not let her do geology. Field work was for men. A woman in the field was considered a distraction. or bad luck, or simply unthinkable. So they sat her at a desk and had her process other people's data and draft other people's maps. It was the pattern that would follow her for the rest of her career, set down right at the start. The men went out into the world and brought back the raw material. The woman stayed inside and turned it into something usable, and the world remembered the men. In 1948, restless and looking for more, Marie Tharp moved to New York City. She went looking for work and found her way to Columbia University, to a brand new research outfit called the Lamont Geological Observatory, perched on an old estate on the Palisades above the Hudson River. It had been founded by a driven, ambitious scientist named Maurice Ewing, who was obsessed with the physics of the deep ocean and was pulling in young researchers to attack it. Lamont in those years was a kind of frontier, full of ambition and short on women in any role that mattered. Marie Tharp was hired as a drafter. She was there to draw. And it was at Lamont that she met the man whose name would be tied to hers for the rest of both their lives, for better and for worse. His name was Bruce Heezen. He was a few years younger than her, a graduate student then, energetic and stubborn and hungry to make his mark. Heezen went to sea. That was his job and his passion, riding the research ships out onto the open Atlantic for weeks at a time, running instruments off the back deck, collecting the data. And the data he was bringing back was a new kind, the kind that would make everything Marie Tharp went on to do possible. That new kind of data was sound. For most of human history, there was only one way to measure the depth of the ocean, and it was almost comically slow. You stopped the ship and you let down a weighted line, foot by foot, until it hit bottom, and then you hauled it back up and read off the length. In water that was miles deep, a single sounding could take hours, and you got one dot, one number for one spot in an ocean the size of the Atlantic. At that rate, charting the whole seafloor would have taken thousands of years. But the war had changed everything, because the war had needed to hunt submarines. And to hunt submarines, the Navy had perfected a machine that bounced sound off objects underwater and timed the echo. The echo sounder. Pointed at the seabed, and it sent a ping straight down and listened for the return. The deeper the water, the longer the echo took to come back. A ship could now steam across the ocean at full speed, pinging the bottom continuously, and unspool a long paper roll that traced the depth beneath it the entire way, mile after mile, a continuous line across the sea. The ships came back to Lamont loaded with these rolls of paper, thousands of feet of them, packed with raw soundings, the deep ocean talking in a language of echoes. And almost nobody had the patience or the eye to translate it. The numbers just sat there. It was Marie Tharp's job to make them mean something. So here is what her work actually looked like. Day after day, year after year. She took the soundings from a ship's crossing of the Atlantic, and she plotted them out as a profile, a vertical slice of the ocean, as if you had sawed straight down through the water and the rock, and were looking at the cut edge, distance along the bottom, and depth below the surface. She did this for crossing after crossing, lining them up north to south, building a stack of profiles that together began to show the shape of the whole ocean basin. It was painstaking, unglamorous, exacting work, the kind that can blind you with tedium, and Marie Tharp loved it. Years later, she described what she felt sitting at that table, with the data of the entire hidden ocean coming to her. The whole world, she said, was spread out before her, or at least the 70% of it covered by water. She had a blank canvas to fill, and a fascinating puzzle to piece together. She called it a once-in-a-lifetime, a once-in-the-history-of-the-world opportunity, and she said it was that especially for a woman in the 1940s. She knew exactly how rare her seat at that table was. And as the profiles piled up, the flat, featureless seabed that everyone had imagined simply dissolved. It was not flat. It was the most rugged terrain on the planet. There were canyons deeper than the Grand Canyon, mountains taller than anything on land, vast plains and sudden cliffs. And running right down the middle of the Atlantic, from north to south, there was a colossal mountain range, a chain of underwater peaks thousands of miles long. Hints of it had been picked up decades earlier, even back when a transatlantic telegraph cable was first laid, but nobody had grasped its true scale. Marie Tharp was watching it emerge in detail for the first time, line by line, under her own pencil. Then came the notch. That V-shaped gash at the very crest of the mountain range, showing up in profile after profile in the same place. She kept finding it. A deep cleft, a valley split into the top of the ridge, as if the whole range had been pulled apart down its spine. The more profiles she drew, the more sure she became that this was not an accident of a few readings. It was continuous. It ran the length of the ridge, and when she sat with what that had to mean, the conclusion was staggering. A crack like that, running for thousands of miles down the center of the ocean, looked exactly like a place where the earth was splitting open, where the seafloor was being torn apart and pulled in two directions. And if the seafloor was pulling apart, then the continents on either side were moving away from each other. That last idea was the dangerous one, because the notion that continents move had a name, and in 1952, that name was close to a curse word in American geology. It was called continental drift, and it had been proposed back in 1912 by a German named Alfred Wegener, who had noticed, as school children still notice, that the coastlines of Africa and South America look like they would fit together like two pieces of a torn page. Wegener argued that they had once been joined, part of a single supercontinent, and had drifted apart over enormous spans of time. He had assembled real evidence, matching rocks and matching fossils on coastlines, now separated by a whole ocean, but he could not explain how. He had no force, no mechanism that could shove a continent across the globe, and so the establishment crushed his idea. They mocked it. By the time Marie Tharp was at her drafting table, a serious American geologist who spoke up for continental drift was risking his reputation and his career. It was treated not as a wrong theory, but as a kind of crank belief, almost a scientific heresy. Wegener himself had died in 1930, on the ice of Greenland, decades before anyone would admit he had been onto something. This was the wall Marie Tharp ran straight into. She had drawn with her own hand what looked like physical proof that the ground was splitting and the continents were on the move. And the man she had to convince first was Bruce Heezen. Heezen did not want to hear it. When she laid out her Rift Valley and what she thought it meant, he dismissed it out of hand. He told her it sounded too much like continental drift, and continental drift, to a careful young scientist trying to build a career, was poison. According to Marie Tharp's own account, he groaned and said it could not be, that it looked too much like continental drift, and he gave her interpretation a label that has stuck to this story ever since. He called it girl talk, as if the conclusion were not a reading of the data, but a flightiness of the woman who drew it. And he told her to erase the Rift Valley from her profiles and do them over. She erased it, and she drew it again, and it was still there. That was the thing about the data. It did not care who was looking at it or what they wanted it to say. The notch came back every time because it was real. It is worth slowing down here to picture what that drawing actually involved, because the romance of the discovery can hide how brutal the labor was. There were no computers doing this. Every profile was built by hand, point by point, from raw numbers off the paper rolls, and a single mistake could ruin a whole crossing. If a profile got plotted in the wrong direction, or a stretch of soundings came out garbled, someone would scrawl a blunt note across it, something like plotted backwards, and the whole thing would have to be redrawn from scratch. Marie Tharp did this for years on end, hunched over a table, turning echoes into geography, one careful line at a time. And the deeper truth is that her instrument was not just the pencil. It was her judgment. The echo sounders did not hand over a clean picture. They gave noisy, broken traces with gaps and errors, and it took a trained, intuitive mind to decide what was a real feature of the seafloor and what was just static in the machine. She was not tracing a photograph, she was reading the ocean. The shape she pulled out of all that noise was an act of interpretation, and that is exactly why it mattered so much that she was the one reading it, and exactly why it stung when the result was waved away as girl talk. So picture the daily reality of that office now. Marie Tharp sat at her map table, plotting the line of the mid-Atlantic ridge, certain she was looking at a crack in the world. And at an adjoining table sat another young worker named Howard Foster, given an entirely separate job. Foster was plotting earthquakes. He had been handed the records of where earthquakes happened in the Atlantic, the locations of their epicenters, tens of thousands of them, and he was marking each one by hand onto a map. The two of them worked side by side on what seemed like two unrelated problems. One mapping the shape of the sea bottom, one mapping where the ground shook. And then somebody put the two maps together, and the hair on the back of your neck stands up just thinking about it. The earthquakes were not scattered randomly across the ocean. They fell in a line, a narrow, twisting line that ran right down the center of the Atlantic, and that line lay directly on top of Marie Tharp's Rift Valley, the exact same path. The place where the seafloor was cracked open was the place where the earth was trembling, over and over, for thousands of miles. Two completely different kinds of evidence, gathered by two different people for two different reasons, pointing at the same conclusion. The middle of the ocean was a seam in the planet. It was alive. It was moving. You cannot argue with that for long, and Heisen could not either. It took him the better part of a year, by her account, to come around, but the earthquakes broke his resistance. The match between the shaking and the rift was too clean to be coincidence. The man who had called it girl talk became its champion. And here we have to be fair to Bruce Heisen, because the story is more tangled than a simple villain and victim. Once he was convinced, he fought hard for the idea in public, and he took real professional risks, defending the Rift Valley and what it implied when much of the field still scoffed. He was not just a man stealing a woman's credit. He was her collaborator, her defender, the one who carried the argument into rooms she was not allowed to enter, and by many accounts the two of them were close for the rest of his life. The injustice in this story is not mainly his cruelty. It is something quieter and more systemic, and we will come back to it. In 1957, Marie Tharp and Bruce Heisen published their first map of the North Atlantic floor, and it did not look like an ordinary chart. There was a reason for that, and the reason was the Cold War. The United States Navy considered detailed contour maps of the ocean bottom to be military secrets. A precise depth chart could help an enemy hide a submarine or help its own submarines navigate, and the Navy did not want that information loose in the world. So Tharp and Heisen could not publish straight scientific contours. Instead, they did something clever and, as it turned out, beautiful. They drew the seafloor the way a landscape painter would draw mountains seen from an airplane, in shaded relief, with the peaks and valleys sketched as if you were looking down on dry land with the water drained away. They called it a physiographic diagram. It dodged the Navy's secrecy rules, and it did something the scientists had not fully expected. It made the bottom of the ocean look like a real place. Anyone could look at it and understand it. You did not need to read contour lines. You could just see the mountains and the great valley splitting them, the way you would see the Rockies from a plane window. And that map changed minds, because seeing is a different thing from being told. It is one thing to hear a colleague claim there is a rift valley running down the Atlantic. It is another to look at a picture of the ocean floor and watch the crack run down the middle of it with your own eyes. The physiographic maps put the new ocean in front of people in a form they could not ignore. Marie Tharp kept going. She and her colleagues followed the ridge and its rift out of the North Atlantic and into the South Atlantic, and it kept going. They found the same kind of split valley in the Indian Ocean, in the Arabian Sea, in the Red Sea, in the Gulf of Aden. What had looked like a feature of one ocean turned out to be part of a single continuous system, a seam that wound around the entire planet like the stitching on a baseball. More than 40,000 miles of underwater mountain range cracked open down its center. It was the largest geographic feature on Earth, and almost no one had known it was there. Marie Tharp had helped draw the outline of the biggest thing on the planet from a desk in New York. And through all of it, year after year, she was not allowed to go to sea. This is the part that is hard to sit with. She was the person who understood the shape of the ocean better than almost anyone alive, and she could not set foot on the ships that gathered the soundings she spent her life interpreting. The reason was not science. It was superstition and prejudice, the old belief among some sailors that a woman aboard brought bad luck, dressed up as policy. Maurice Ewing, who ran Lamont, kept women off the observatory's research vessels. So while Bruce Heezen and the other men rowed out onto the Atlantic and felt the deck move and watched the instruments record the bottom in real time, Marie Tharp received it all secondhand, as rolls of paper and columns of numbers carried back to her table. She built the ocean in her mind out of other people's voyages. She did not finally get out onto the water until 1965, and even then, it took going around her own institution to do it. By her telling, the chance came on a cruise that Heezen organized aboard a ship from Duke University, because at Lamont, the ban on women still held. After all those years, the woman who had mapped the Atlantic seafloor finally got to be on the ocean she had charted. A few years later, in 1968, she was part of an expedition aboard a Navy ship called the Cane, out studying the very fracture zones in the mid-ocean ridge that she had spent years drawing. She had finally crossed the water she knew better than the back of her hand, and she had needed special arrangements and a sympathetic colleague to be allowed to do the most basic thing the men around her did as a matter of course. The credit was its own long, slow story. Through the late 1950s and into the 1960s, as the idea of a moving seafloor went from heresy to the hottest question in earth science, the breakthrough papers were published, and Marie Tharp's name was often simply not on them. The maps she had drawn, the rift she had identified, the global ridge system she had helped trace, these became central to the greatest revolution in the history of geology. But in the official record, the authorship frequently belonged to the men. She was the drafter, she was support. The men brought the data, the men wrote the papers, and the woman who had seen the shape of the truth at her table was a name in the acknowledgments, if she was named at all. And here is the revolution she helped bring about, because the Rift Valley turned out to be the loose thread that pulled the whole old picture of the Earth apart. In the years that followed, scientists figured out the mechanism that poor Alfred Wegener had been missing for half a century. Down at the rift, in the center of the ocean, molten rock was rising up from inside the Earth and hardening into brand new seafloor. That new floor pushed out to either side, slowly, a few centimeters a year, about as fast as your fingernails grow. The seafloor was spreading. It was being born at the ridge and carried outward in both directions, and as it moved, it carried the continents with it, like cargo on a conveyor belt of rock. The continents were not plowing through the ocean floor, which was the impossible thing Wegener could never explain. They were riding on it. The surface of the Earth was broken into great rigid plates, and those plates were in constant grinding motion, pulling apart at the ridges, crashing together to throw up mountains, grinding past each other to make earthquakes. They named it plate tectonics, and it is the foundation that all of modern geology now rests on. It explains the mountains and the volcanoes and the earthquakes and the shape of the continents and the deep history of the planet itself. And it was confirmed in part by a crack in the ocean floor that a woman had drawn and a man had told her to erase. Wegener was vindicated, decades after he died in the cold, and Marie Tharp had been right. That day in 1952, when she looked at the notch in her profiles and dared to think it meant the continents move, In 1977, Marie Tharp and Bruce Heesen, working with an Austrian landscape painter named Heinrich Beran, completed the thing they had been building toward for nearly 30 years, a single sweeping painted map of the entire floor of the world ocean, every ridge and trench and abyssal plain rendered as if the seas had been emptied and you were looking down on the naked face of the planet. National Geographic published it, and it hung on walls in classrooms and offices and homes all over the country, the way Marie Tharp's grandest work finally reaching ordinary people. It is one of the most recognizable maps ever made. Most of the people who looked at it had no idea that the woman who spent her life drawing what was on it had never been allowed to ride the ships that measured it. Bruce Heesen did not live to see it published. He died that same year, in 1977, of a heart attack aboard a Navy submarine near Iceland, out studying the very ridge the two of them had given their lives to mapping. He was only 53. After his death, Marie Tharp kept working on their shared project, and she carried it the rest of the way. They had been bound together for 3 decades, the man who went to sea and the woman who could not, and in the end, she finished the map alone. The recognition she had been denied for so long did finally come, though much of it came late, when she was an old woman. National Geographic gave her its Hubbard Medal. The Library of Congress, which holds her maps, named her one of the 4 greatest cartographers of the 20th century. Woods Hole, the great oceanographic institution, honored her as a pioneer. Her own Lamont, the place that had kept her off its ships, gave her its first Heritage Award in 2001 and set up a fellowship in her name to support women in the earth sciences. She had lived long enough to watch the establishment that overlooked her lineup to call her a pioneer. Marie Tharp died in 2006 at the age of 86, and one of the most remarkable things about her, in all the interviews and writing she left behind, is how little bitterness she carried. She had every reason to be furious. She had been barred from the field as a young woman, barred from the ships for most of her career, told her central insight was girl talk, and left off the papers that made her work famous. And yet looking back near the end, she said, plainly, that she had worked in the background for most of her career as a scientist, but that she had absolutely no resentments. She did not need the record corrected to know what she had done. She knew what she had seen at that table. Establishing the Rift Valley and the mid-ocean ridge that ran all the way around the world for 40,000 miles, she said, that was something important. She did not say it was important for a woman. She said it was important. Full stop. So the next time you see one of those maps, the floor of the ocean laid bare with its mountains and its great central seam, or the next time you hear that the ground under your feet is slowly, ceaselessly moving, remember where a big piece of that knowledge came from. It came from a woman who was never allowed to touch the ocean she understood best. It came from thousands of numbers, turned into lines, turned into a shape, by a pair of hands at a desk on a hill above the Hudson. She could not go where the data came from, so she pulled the whole hidden bottom of the world up onto a sheet of paper, and she saw the truth in it before the men around her would let themselves believe it. The deepest, most invisible place on Earth was mapped by someone who was told to stay on land. And she was right. If you want more forgotten stories like this one, the people history walked past, and the truths they saw first, subscribe and stay with us.